Topic number 5 is dealing with how to find a perpendicular bisector in a coordinate plane. So there's a series of 5 steps that you need to complete. So they're all listed right here. So I'm just going to run through these different steps with you. Keep in mind you can find perpendicular bisectors using a compass. That's a very common construction, but for right now we're going to focus on a coordinate plane. And when we focus on a coordinate plane, you can do these on a graph, but you also need to know how to do these algebraically. So these 5 steps are basically the algebraic way of finding a perpendicular bisector. Because keep in mind there's times where you're going to get decimals and fractions and you won't have nice numbers to work with on a graph. However, I will show you how to check this and verify it on a graph as well. So the first step we're going to do is we're going to find the midpoint. So if you recall a perpendicular bisector, if I have this segment and I want to find the perpendicular bisector, it's the line that goes through the midpoint so that you get 2 congruent parts. So it divides the segment into 2 congruent parts, and the line is perpendicular. So the first thing we have to do is we have to find, well, what point is this perpendicular bisector going to pass through, and it's the midpoint. So the first step here is finding the midpoint, and the midpoint formula, x1 plus x2 over 2, comma, y1 plus y2 over 2. So basically you're taking the average of the x values and then the average of the y values. So when we go to do that, if I'm trying to find the perpendicular bisector of segment AB, that means I need to find the point in the middle of this segment. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add the x's. So I have 6 plus negative 6 over 2. And then I'm going to add the y's. So 2 plus 4 over 2. And then you just go ahead and you simplify each piece. So 6 plus negative 6 is 0 over 2, comma, 2 plus 4 is 6 over 2. And then we go ahead and we simplify these. So 0 divided by 2 is 0. 6 divided by 2 is 3. So the midpoint is 0, comma 3. Now to verify that on a graph, what I do is I start with plotting my points. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up 2. Make sure you label them. Then we have negative 6, 4. So here's my segment that I'm trying to find the perpendicular bisector of. So I start by finding the midpoint. So the easiest way to find the midpoint on a graph is to count the distance. So I had to go down 2 and then over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I'm going to do half of those things to get the point in the middle. So down 1 over 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm going to label that M for the midpoint. So then the next step, so going back over to the algebraic process, is to find the slope of the segment. So we're going to find the slope of AB. And remember that the slope formula, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So when we find the slope, we're going to go ahead and we're going to label this the slope of segment AB. So I'm going to subtract the y's. So it's going to be 4 minus 2. And then I'm going to subtract the x's. So negative 6 minus 6. So we get 2 on top, negative 12 on the bottom, which becomes negative 1 over 6 when you divide the top and bottom both by 2. Hopefully you recognize the pattern here with these. Negative 2 over 12. This is the same thing as negative 12 over 2, or it's the same thing as negative 2 over 12 as 2 over negative 12. It doesn't matter where the negative is. It can go out in front, it can go on top, it can go on the bottom. It doesn't matter. If you look over here, my slope, I counted down 2, right 12 means negative 2 over 12. So there is a pattern there. So I could have found the slope on the graph that way as well. So then the next step, if we go back up here, step number 3, find the perpendicular slope. So the perpendicular slope means to take the slope I just found in step 2 and flip and negate it. So the perpendicular slope, notice my subscript now I put the perpendicular, so I know I'm finding the perpendicular slope. Flip 1 over 6, so it becomes 6 over 1. Negate it, it becomes positive. So you can also write this as 6 over 1. So if you were looking on the graph, it would be up 6, right 1. So now the next step after that is to find the y-intercept. So the y-intercept, you want to use the perpendicular slope and the midpoint, because this really becomes one of those problems in the last topic where you need to write an equation that's perpendicular to this given line, and it has to pass through the midpoint. So that means I have to use the midpoint and the perpendicular slope and plug into y equals mx plus b to figure out what's the y-intercept. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to plug in and find the y-intercept. So I have to use steps 1 and 3 for this. My answer is from steps 1 and 3. So y equals mx plus b. Make sure that you use the midpoint. So the midpoint is 0, 3. Make sure you use the perpendicular slope, which is 6. And then you're going to solve for b. So 3 equals 0 plus b. 3 equals b. Now, some of you might have recognized that, like, why am I going through and finding the y-intercept? Well, I didn't really have to, because for this particular problem, the y-intercept is already the midpoint. It's on the midpoint's on the y-axis. However, that's not always the case, so that's why I wanted to go through the process. So you're always using the midpoint as a line it has to pass through, perpendicular to this line, figure out the y-intercept. Once you know the y-intercept, that's how you know where your where to count your slope to create your line, to create your perpendicular bisector. So my last step here is to just write the equation. So to write the equation of the perpendicular bisector, you're using the perpendicular slope, because it's the perpendicular bisector, and the y-intercept, so that it forces the y-intercept that you found, that forces your perpendicular bisector to go through your midpoint, because I really plugged in my midpoint to find this y-intercept. So now when I write my equation, it's y equals 6x plus the y-intercept. So there's the equation. Now up top here, if you wanted to finish this up, well, we know that this slope of the original is negative 2 over 12, or negative 1 over 12, or negative 1 over 6. So if I want to find the perpendicular, remember the perpendicular slope was positive 6 over 1, so up 6, right 1. So to graph it, you would count up 6, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 over 1, and then do the opposite, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, down 1. And when you connect those, that would be the perpendicular bisector. So that's the graph of the perpendicular bisector, which is also the equation y equals 6x plus 3, which is what we wanted to find. So this line is perpendicular and it bisects that given segment. So now you don't have to do these on a graph. You do have to know how to do these algebraically though. So you do have to know these 5 steps. The graphing part is optional.